unstable?
Yes, it's a little
Oh,
bit
why? Okay.
unstable,
And
yes.
now I know what you mean. Okay. Yeah, okay.
I want you to be safe, actually. I don't want to be the guy that... Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for waiting for us, actually. It's an honor and privilege hosting the Minister of Communication and Information and also Trade of Singapore. And he was kind enough to accept our invitation to speak in the inaugural Istanbul FinTech Week. Mr. Minister, welcome. Is it your first time in Istanbul?
No, it's not my first, but it's always very pleasant to visit Istanbul. I love it. You're a beautiful city and the hospitality is great. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful. Hope you're enjoying your visits. And let me ask my first question. We are aware that Singapore has become an international hub of finance and you're developing programs to leverage technology. What is your strategy here? How and why has Singapore positioned itself as a hub of innovation and knowledge economy?
So for Singapore, I think many of you would be familiar. We're a small country and our economy is highly dependent on trade. In fact, our trade is about 3 to 4 times our gross domestic product. So because of the importance of trade, we emphasize a great deal on our international connectivity and therefore also the competitiveness of our economy and the different sectors. So in that context, we have always wanted to ensure that our businesses and our sectors are able to use technology to make themselves competitive, productive, and innovative. So this is part of our larger strategy for our economy. So for example, today we are working on 23 verticals in our economy. Each one of those verticals, they account together for about 80% of our GDP. And for each one of those, we have a digital plan, an innovation plan, and an internationalization plan in order to achieve this sustained productivity and innovation growth in the sectors. So technology is a large part of our emphasis because it helps to support innovation. And within that, FinTech is a very important part of our effort. And we can talk more about this, but I want to emphasize that we feel that when you work on things like FinTech and more broadly technology, it's very important that all the parties come together. Government, the private sector, and the talent, the people have to come together because these are new and cutting-edge areas, and I don't think any one group has got all the knowledge and capabilities to make it work successfully, and we need a collaborative approach to make it happen.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you. And let's talk a little bit about the FinTech in Singapore, more deep and FinTech side. What is the role of financial technologies in your programs? How does the Singapore government support key actors like VCs, accelerators, hubs, and the other parties in due course?
So I'll talk about FinTech, but let me just say that FinTech is an example of how we are harnessing technology, but we are doing it across the board for many of our sectors. If I can just give you some example of what I mean by that. You know, in our economy, manufacturing is about 20% of our GDP. Financial services, insurance services and the related areas, they account for about 32% of our GDP. And trade-related services like wholesale trade, retail trade, and so on, they account for about 25% of our GDP. In all of these areas, you can use technology. If you talk about manufacturing, it's not just about automation, it's about IoT, it's about data analytics and how you can take it further. If you're talking about trade and trade-related services, a lot of the things we talk about in terms of blockchain, in terms of distributed ledger systems, they become very important for trade. and the trade areas are very interlinked with financial services, where we talk about FinTech. So because of the importance of financial services in our economy, and we've got quite a large, several, Singapore banks, we have 3, but we've also got then many international players in Singapore. And they're not just doing business in Singapore for Singapore, but for the region and international. So for us, FinTech becomes a very important part of that, because that's where a lot of the innovation is taking place in the financial services. So what we have done with FinTech, and I think this is an area we can talk about, but I gather you're having similar challenges. You have to bring in the existing banks, financial institutions, because they are the established players. You have to bring the disruptors, the FinTech type companies, and you got to bring in the regulators, because very often FinTech needs regulatory flexibility. And you got to bring all of this together in order to achieve the outcomes. Because if FinTech moves, but the banks resist and the regulator doesn't accommodate, you can't get the outcomes. So we've been working with FinTech with that objective in mind. So the whole spectrum of FinTech initiatives. But the idea really is, how can we introduce FinTech and its benefits to a larger financial ecosystem, whilst taking care to ensure that our concerns around system stability for financial services is maintained.
Thank you. Thank you. Putting up all these programs and initiatives, you need talent and human resources, Based on our international audience, how would you comment on Singapore being in a leading position to attract talent and entrepreneurs from around the world?
I mean, we are one place. I know there are many other places in the world that do this, including in Turkey and Istanbul. But let me just share with you how we are going, what we do. I think the most important point is there's no one silver bullet. I think you need a holistic approach, and to building up an ecosystem which will then continue to attract talent and innovation. So what do I mean by that? So first of all, on the part of the government, your ability to have a business-friendly environment and also a regulatory environment that is flexible. So in the context of FinTech, for example, and more generally in technology, we adopt an approach that we call the sandbox approach. What we mean by that is, when let's say you have an innovation that needs a regulatory change. Now, if you're a banking sector regulator, the concern is, what is the implication for the whole banking system? So you don't want to make a major shift overnight. But you might be prepared to consider creating some space for the innovator to work with the regulator and others to try it out, so in a sandbox. So we do that as a government in order to try and encourage innovation. So how can we get innovators working? But that's one part, government working on regulations. Then it's about building up the ecosystem. In Singapore, for example, in the technology area, we have the Alibabas, the Facebooks, the Amazons, and so on. And so they create the larger ecosystem, and including some of our own local local companies, as well as some unicorns that we have. So they create the ecosystem which allows the talent flow to then come as well, to be drawn and then to be developed. And then finally, we invest a great deal in building up the capability of our people in terms of training and retraining. Because today, there's a global shortage of talent when you're talking about ICT, and in particular, the higher end areas around, say, cybersecurity and so on. So your ability to invest and develop those talents, both in your own people who are already in the space, but maybe attracting talent from overseas, that's also an important factor. So what I want to emphasize is, at the end of the day, the approach we take is to bring the different parties to the table and try and find a collective way forward, an approach where all of us have a role to play. So the government certainly stepping up and doing its part, whether it is in terms of regulations or supporting, but also the private sector and also the talent flow. part and developing them. And that's been our approach for FinTech as well.
I was about to say that in regulation part especially, I see MAS as a proactive, acting like proactive way. What do you think about, what is the difference for them, the difference for the other regulatory authority?
The difference between MAS and Turkey?
Not Turkey, but from a part of the world, I mean, yeah. Especially the regulation side, would you tell a little bit about the regulation side?
So I think MAS has, our Monetary Authority of Singapore has been taking a very progressive stance when it comes to the FinTech regulatory environment. What MAS does in FinTech is not different to say what our Energy Market Authority does in energy regulations, or some of our building and building construction control type of authorities do for urban solutions and things like that. Because all of them, and in general the mindset we have in our government is, you regulate because you want to ensure safety and certain standards in the things that, in the services that we are regulating, but you also want to have regulatory flexibility to allow for innovation. Because if you over-regulate, you can't innovate, and if you don't innovate, then eventually the services will become less productive, less attractive. So that's been the guiding approach. And in the case of FinTech, MAS has been working with platforms, with the established banks, with the startup community, in order to create the kind of solutions. And I'll give you one example, which I was sharing earlier with Demet as well. In Singapore, payment solutions. Let's take something very simple like a payment solution. And I think in Turkey, you'll be very aware, different banks have their own wallets that they pay with, the e-wallets. But the e-wallet is then a peer-to-peer solution, meaning it's only amongst fellow customers of the same bank. When you want to pay somebody from another bank, I think there will be a challenge through your electronic transfers and so on. We had the same problem in Singapore. So the regulator stepped up and said, basically, look, there has to be a national payment infrastructure. And so we created a national payment infrastructure called PayNow, and all the banks and financial institutions, they just plug into that. So today in Singapore, I can use my phone, and anybody in Singapore whose bank account is connected to their phone number by name, I can make a transfer to them. And about a year back, we also brought in the businesses. So now you can make a transfer to a business as well using the same thing. So it's a common platform, and the QR codes is the other part where we have standardized the QR codes. So everybody uses the same QR code. This is basically in recognition of the fact that many of these are, basically it's infrastructure, you know, and you want to treat payment systems as part of a national infrastructure and make them as hassle-free as possible, so that then the innovation can take place on top of that platform.
Thank you, thank you. My last question is coming. My last question is on the future. What do you think of the future prospects given impactful technologies in financial services?
So I think it's a very exciting prospects, but also challenging ones. And let me explain what I mean. The excitement comes from the fact that new technologies like artificial intelligence and also, you know, some of the deep learning techniques that are being used to fuel AI, I think these are going to have a big impact in the financial services and in fact across all sectors. So because of that, I think the possibilities are going to be enormous. But therein also lies the challenge, because you have to find the balance between how do you use technology to have greater growth, innovation, and, you know, in terms of the services and so on, but at the same time taking care of the core principles, you know, around the security of data of customers. How do you ensure people are able to continue to benefit from this and they're not just bypassed in the process? So I think when we work on some of these new technology areas, and which I think offer FinTech and many other areas great prospects, we also need to ensure that the regulatory objective of maintaining security, privacy is important. And at the same time, we also need to invest in building up the people's capability so that they don't get bypassed by the technology and they can adapt to the new technologies and get the jobs there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I greatly appreciate your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the time in Turkey.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I just wanted to say that, there's a lot of buzz here in Istanbul. I think this is your inaugural Istanbul FinTech Festival. We have a FinTech Festival in Singapore in November. I think you've been to it.
Yes, 2 times.
And I think there's some partnership going on and so on.
Exactly.
And I encourage all of you to find the opportunity to come there because I think you'll find it's an international event and there will be very interesting conversations you can have and partnerships that can be struck.
Let us give Mr. Minister a round of applause, please. Yeah.